All right, guys, we're back at it. So we're starting today with Chapter 9. It's called the Federalist Era. We're basically going to be dealing with the very first presidency. So far, we've dealt with setting the government up, all the trials and the tribulations that America went through, getting free of Britain and the first government under the Articles of Confederation, and how that didn't work, and then how they made the compromise that led to the Constitution. Well, now we're talking about what happens after we get the Constitution. We got what we wanted. What do we do with it? So the first president, George Washington, is going to be your first lesson. Lesson 2 is going to deal with early challenges to the Constitution, basically what happens when trouble starts in America and we have to use these new rules, these new laws that we've made up to try to solve those problems. And then finally, the first political parties. We're going to talk about how this entire situation between the Democrats and the Republicans today and various parties throughout American history started, and why the very people that tried to create a government without having political parties ended up forming political parties just a few years after they wrote the Constitution. So the people that did everything in their power to try to keep this from happening became part of the problem. So we'll try to kind of figure out why that works and how that occurs. So just quick overview stuff. This is not going to be super in-depth. We'll probably do some other videos for lesson 1, 2, and 3 separately. This is just kind of to introduce you to the ideas and make sure that you've kind of got a warm-up and a link between all the things that we're talking about. So lesson 1 deals with George Washington. He takes president. He basically is sworn in, and his VP is a guy named John Adams. Now, George Washington and John Adams both are Federalists. And what that means is that they believe early on that the federal government needs to have power. If you can remember way back to Chapter 8, we talked about Federalists and Anti-Federalists. And it was how much power the federal government, the big government, the national government, is going to have. Washington and Adams both basically believe in the national government having a lot of power. Here's what Washington is going to do. Once he becomes president, he knows he can't make every decision on his own. A good leader has people that he can trust that follow him. So Washington is going to set up what he's going to call his cabinet. And it's basically the people that he appoints to handle certain parts of the country's affairs. So he's going to have a Secretary of Defense. He's going to have a Secretary of the Interior and the Treasury. He's going to have basically these guys who their job is to know everything there is to know about their part of their job. And they're going to tell him what they think needs to be done, and he's going to coordinate it all. So the first thing that happens when this occurs, when he sets up his cabinet, is Congress, the legislative branch, is going to decide we need to figure out how much power should George Washington have over this cabinet. Is he in charge of it? Or are they placed there and they should be able to give him advice, but he can't fire them? So there's going to be an argument about how much power this cabinet should have and how much power Washington should have over his cabinet. As a president, Washington's not going to focus a whole lot on making laws. He's not going to focus a whole lot on getting stuff done inside the country if he can help it. He's going to mostly focus on foreign affairs. So how does America deal with other countries around the world? And he's going to focus on military matters. Makes sense. He was a general. He needs to figure out how to make America strong enough that we don't have to worry about someone coming back and trying to take over our country, on the Native Americans being able to resist expansion. How do we make our military strong enough that we're actually a threat to people so they won't attack us? Alexander Hamilton, who you've probably heard of at this point, is going to be the guy that handles money for George Washington. This is where Hamilton really kind of shines with regard to American history. He's going to have maybe the hardest job of anyone in the first presidency under Washington. Hamilton's got to deal with, he's basically handed this horrible situation. America has borrowed money from the citizens, from other countries. We are millions of dollars in debt the moment we become a country. And Hamilton is given this terrible situation and they say, fix it. make it happen. And he's got to figure out, how can I pay this money back and get credit so that our country can borrow money when it needs to, and actually make all the countries that we owe money happy and all the citizens that we owe money to happy, so that we can actually make this work. And he's going to have a real hard time doing it. And people are going to fight with him, and he's going to have to make compromises, and he's going to make some enemies doing this. But he's actually going to come up with some pretty decent plans for it. Now, what's going to happen is, in the process of figuring out how to solve all this money problems, and in the process of Washington trying to solve foreign affairs and building a powerful military, Hamilton, Washington, and Adams, his vice president, are going to end up kind of forming this political group. Washington thinks of himself as above it. He's not part of it, he thinks, but most of the time he goes along with Hamilton and Adams. And they're going to basically say, we need a strong government. That was the problem with the Articles of Confederation. It was too weak. We need a strong government that can solve problems, that can handle issues. And they're going to build that government. But when they're building it, they're going to make some people upset. A couple of the people they make upset is Thomas Jefferson and a guy named James Madison. That's going to make these guys worried. They helped write the Constitution. They were there when they figured out, this is what we're going to do for our government. This is what the legislative, the executive, the judicial branch is going to do. This is what implied powers are. This is what enumerated powers are. This is what reserved powers are. They were all there in the same room writing it, but they're going to argue about what it means. And what's going to happen is James Madison and Thomas Jefferson are going to get together to kind of get on the other side of the fence from Washington, from Adams, and from Hamilton. And this is going to be the seed of the beginning of the party split in America. So, lesson 2 is going to talk about some of the problems that start while Washington is president. One of the big ones, one of the first ones we'll talk about, is citizens are upset about taxes. Governments need taxes. They need money. They need that money to do everything that a government's supposed to do. Run an army, build roads, keep the public healthy, basically protect our country and make things work the way they're supposed to work. People don't like paying taxes anyway. No one likes them. They just happen. So what's going to happen is the government's going to start passing some taxes. Specifically, they pass a tax on whiskey. Now, a bunch of farmers in Pennsylvania are going to get real upset about this whiskey tax. And they're going to have a rebellion called the Whiskey Rebellion. Now, what's going to happen is these farmers in Pennsylvania are going to take a bunch of pitchforks and torches, and they are going to attack some tax collectors, these guys that go door to door to pick up money, and they're going to burn government buildings down for these taxes, and they're just going to start a ruckus. They are starting a fight, and they are basically causing issues and making noise, and that's going to make Washington have to come to a decision. Is he going to let people do this? Or is he going to show that the government is strong and can put people back in their place? The government is going to use force against American citizens to keep the country running. Washington basically looks at it as a bad decision, but he's going to do it anyway, and he's going to send federal troops, soldiers, to Pennsylvania to put this rebellion down. He's going to tell these people, you are not allowed to riot against the government, period. That was in 1791. The country had been a country for less than 5 years. Washington was basically, in the first few years of his rule, of his presidency, he's basically saying, yep, there's going to be people that don't like it. They got to suck it up and deal with it. And we're going to make them do it if they won't do it on their own. Now, another problem going on in America at this point is the Native Americans. Americans are expanding westward. We're over the Appalachian Mountains. We're heading our way west. We're basically getting through the Ohio River Valley. We're expanding. Native Americans don't like it. Obviously, they don't like it. They are fighting more than they had in the past, and they're actually being encouraged to fight. British ambassadors are basically going to these Native Americans and telling them, you should stop the Americans from going and fighting you this way. They're going to these Native Americans, they're going to them, and they're basically riling them up. They're getting them ready for a fight. They might be giving them weapons on occasion. They're basically talking them up, though. They're just saying, they're that hype man on the corner that's going like, you got them, you can take them, fight those guys. Fight them, see what happens. Native Americans know they're not going to win that fight, not long term, but they might make it difficult enough that the Americans are going to make a treaty with them. So, they fight. Britain is also involved in a war with France at this point. And what's going to happen is Britain is going to need soldiers. Now, Britain tries to talk Americans into joining by volunteering. Washington says Americans aren't allowed to do that. So Britain starts doing something called impressment. What that means is the British ships would be sailing around and they'd see an American ship and they'd sail up to it and they'd say, hey, guess what? You're in the British Navy. And people would say, no, I'm not. I'm an American sailor. I do what I want. I'm free. And the British said, nope, you're in the Navy. And they basically take them and they force them to be in the Navy. It's like drafting somebody from not in your country. So what's going to happen is the Americans are obviously going to start getting upset because they're looking at these British soldiers trying to start a fight between Native Americans and Americans, or at least making the fight worse. And then you're looking at British soldiers basically stealing American citizens. The French are going to be trying to get Americans to join their fight too. The French are basically saying, hey, we helped you in your revolution, you should help us. Now, the problem is, most Americans at this point still remember and have family in Britain. So there's a lot of Americans that like Britain. There's a lot of Americans that like France. And that's going to be an arguing point between various groups of people in America at this point in time. It's going to be one of the things that Washington has to try to solve. How do you make everybody kind of happy? And his decision is pretty okay. He decides, we're just going to be neutral. We're just going to stay out of it. It's not good for America to get in a fight between two countries half a world away. We'll just stay away from all those guys. We'll let them do their thing. Eventually, he's going to have to do something about the impressment, but at that point, there's nothing really to be done, and he doesn't want to start a war, so he just kind of tries to keep people from being in that situation. Now, that's most of Washington's presidents. So what's going to happen is Washington's going to make a farewell address. Most presidents do this. They basically say, hey, here's my final thoughts, my final warnings, my look out for the futures, my good jobs, that kind of stuff. Just how do we close it out? So what they're going to do is he's going to set up this idea that America needs to stay permanently clear of getting involved in other countries' business. His idea is basically if America starts getting involved with all these other countries, they're going to drag us into issues. They're going to drag us into problems. The more people you have around you, the more countries you have around you, the more drama you have. Washington thinks America needs to just handle its own business and stay out of everyone else's. He's also going to warn people that America is moving towards what's called a party system. That basically you're going to start having groups in the government that are all working together against other groups in the government. And what it's going to cause is it's going to cause a bunch of fighting and a bunch of basically people saying that you're the worst people in the world if you're a different political party than they are. But it's going to happen anyway. And that's basically what Lesson 3 is going to be about. It's going to be about the setup of these political parties. So Washington is a Federalist. He votes with Federalists most of the time. He basically supports their policies. He agrees with what they're generally saying. Alexander Hamilton is a Federalist. John Adams is a Federalist. They believe in that strong national government. They believe in this idea of the implied powers in the Constitution. We talked about enumerated powers. Those were powers that were lined out, written down, numbered in the Constitution for the federal government. We also talked about implied powers. That's the idea of the elastic clause, or the idea that you can stretch the enumerated powers to fit other things that are needed, necessary and proper powers. Things that the government has to do that they didn't think about when they wrote the Constitution, but it needs to be able to do them. That's what the Federalists believe. Now, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, they're going to start a different party. They're going to start a party called the Democratic Republicans. And what these guys are going to believe is a very strict reading of the Constitution. Not a, let's go ahead and just interpret it the way we want it to be, but it says this is what it means. And they're going to come up with this idea that the government really has to keep a limited amount of power. If we make it too strong, it's going to be too powerful for the citizens to have any control over, and the government needs to not be that strong. That was the idea of limited government in the first place. So what's going to happen is The people that wrote the Constitution start arguing about what the Constitution meant. It's not just that we argue about it. We argue about it today still. The Supreme Court still talks about what does it mean. The executive branch under President Obama and President Trump have both expanded their powers under the implied powers clauses. But they argued about it. The people that wrote it. Think about it for a minute. You write some rules down with your friend. You and your friend figure out the ground rules for how you're going to act. A year later, you're looking at it and you're saying, what did we mean? I think it meant this. And your friend says, no, it's not what that meant at all. I think it meant this. You literally wrote it down. You were literally there thinking about it, writing it, and now you're arguing about what it meant. That's where the political parties come in. That's where this idea of the Federalists, the people that wanted a very strong federal government, versus the Democratic Republicans, the people who wanted a very limited federal government, come to play. Now, what's going to happen with this is after Washington retires, John Adams, who is a Federalist, is going to be elected president. Thomas Jefferson, who is a Democratic Republican, is going to be elected vice president. And they are going to have all kinds of issues. Thomas Jefferson is going to badmouth John Adams so much, it is going to be ridiculous. It's a whole different thing than what we think about in politics today. We don't think about our vice president as talking trash about our president very often. Other people do, other political parties do, but not the vice president usually. It's set up a little differently at this point in time. Thomas Jefferson, he says some dirty stuff. He's pretty rough on John Adams, somewhat rightly. One of the problems that's going to occur during this presidency is this thing called the Alien and Sedition Acts. So what's going to happen is there's going to be some people that are not citizens of the United States, which in this case they're going to be called aliens. They're not from America, who are going to start causing some trouble, talking some mess about what America is doing at that point in time. And they're going to be charged with sedition, which means undermining or cutting against the government. Now, that's going to sweep up some people that are American citizens also. And what's going to happen is John Adams, with this Alien and Sedition Act, is going to enforce some rules and some laws that a lot of people argue are not enforceable in America because of the Bill of Rights. He's basically going to tell some people and some newspapers and some various groups, you're not allowed to say that. And they're going to say that I'm allowed to say it based on the First Amendment. And there's going to be a lot of arguing about this. And a lot of people are going to start doubting how much power we should give the government, because by the second president, people are starting to do some stuff that seems like it's against the Bill of Rights and the Constitution of America. So the American government in general is going to basically get a kick in the butt, but the Democratic Republicans under Thomas Jefferson are going to get some good publicity, because they're basically going to be able to say, we told you what would happen if you let a government have too much power. We need to do something about this. So that's our chapter introduction for chapter 9. We'll do a little bit more in-depth stuff as we go. Thanks for watching. I hope this helps. Have a good day.